Welcome back to the channel. In today's video, it's time to go over the results of the themed Letterboxd 4 for the month of May, which was animated films. Now, if you haven't seen any of the previous episodes in this series, this video is going to be in a playlist, so you can go back and watch any of those. But a quick, kind of brief idea of what this is just each month I'm taking a different category, and we're finding what my Letterboxd 4 in that category is. Now, at the beginning of the month, I do what's called like a preview video where we introduce the category, and then I give you what's currently in my Letterboxd 4. And then throughout the month, I watch a bunch of films that fit that category. And then there's this video, which is the results video, which usually is a little bit earlier than when I'm getting this one uploaded, but it's kind of right toward the beginning of the next month where we go over the results of that. So that's what we're doing here. Now, in these results videos, how this is going to work is where I'm just going to give a quick little rundown over everything that I watched this month. And one thing I noticed is that animated films typically tend to be around 90 minutes, so I watched a lot this month. I think this is a record for the most number of films in a category that I watched in the month, so there's a lot that we're going to get to. So we're going to go through all of those, and then we'll talk about what either left my Letterboxd for and what was new that came in, and then just again a brief discussion about everything that stayed in that Letterboxd for. And then one last quick thing that I do want to talk about before we get in is just a reminder that I limited this to one film per series, because there's one series in particular that you're going to see here in a couple seconds that would have been like all four of the slots, at least three of the four slots. So I limited it to just one entry per franchise. But without further ado, let's just jump straight into the honorable mentions. Toy Story. If I ever did a draft of favorite characters in film history, Buzz Lightyear would be my 101. And if I did a draft of favorite film franchises, Toy Story would be my 101 in that draft as well. This was my favorite series as a kid, and every time I've watched them over the years, I've grown to love them more and more. Toy Story 3. I'm not alone in my love of this film, as it is regarded by many as the best of the franchise. However, the love and nostalgia that I have for the original two is so great that I have a hard time definitively putting this over them. The third act is so strong and so full of emotion that it provides an amazing conclusion to the trilogy. Toy Story 4. Despite what I said just 5 seconds ago, I really like Toy Story 4, and don't think it tarnishes the original trilogy, as some have said. It's definitely a tier below the other three, but giving Woody an emotional goodbye film after Andy's emotional goodbye in 3 really worked for me. I am nervous for Toy Story 5, but even if we get another Lightyear misstep, it won't affect the love that I have for the first 4 films. Shrek. When this first came out, it was one my parents wouldn't let us watch, so I vividly remember the first time seeing this years later at my cousin's house. At the time, I probably only got half the jokes and references, but it was still one of the funniest movies I had ever seen. The film has taken on a new life as a memeable film, but it's still so good that it lives beyond the memes. Shrek 2. In all honesty, this was actually about to be in my Letterboxd 4 until the morning I'm recording this video, when I made a last-second switch. A sequel that takes all the elements that worked in the first, elevates them, and then throws in a Puss in Boots to the mix. I've always loved the original 2 films, but this rewatch is the one that pushed them into the all-time favorites category. The Lion King. Don't get me wrong, I love The Lion King, but definitely not to the degree that a lot of people do. James Earl Jones and Jeremy Irons are delightful in their roles as Mufasa and Scar. You'll notice this reoccurring theme throughout the video, but this is the first of many Disney classics where I think I prefer the soundtrack over the film itself. Mulan. Yet again, another Disney classic where I absolutely love the soundtrack. The action in the script worked way better for me here than it does in other Disney films. As a kid, the scene where they defeat the villain was so memorable and satisfying that it instantly became a favorite of mine. Wreck-It Ralph. My family didn't go to the movie theater a lot when I was a teenager, so I vividly remember the movies that we did see. I knew nothing about Wreck-It Ralph at the time, but I loved it. I've only seen the film a couple times since then, but it absolutely holds up and was very close to getting a spot in the Letterboxd 4. Finding Nemo. As many animated comedies do, there has to be the over-the-top comedic relief sidekick, and as far as those go, Dory has always been one of my least favorite in that genre. I remember liking Finding Nemo a fair amount as a kid, but it definitely never reached that level of love. Finding Dory. For the reason I said 10 seconds ago, and the fact that I was much older when this came out, I never got around to watching the sequel until now. The story overall just wasn't as captivating or intriguing as the original. I didn't hate the film, but I don't think this is one that I'll be eager to revisit ever again. A Bug's Life. I feel like this is one of the Disney Pixar films that gets talked about the least, but I love it. I love the world building and the way each different character and species plays into it. What I've learned from rewatching all of these films is that especially as a kid, but even now, I love a story about a ragtag group of misfits coming together. Shark Tale. As a kid, this was my introduction to just about all of these actors, but definitely to Martin Scorsese and Robert De Niro. I think knowing those two were in this film made me think that this was a more important film than it actually was. While it isn't the masterpiece that the all-star cast might make you think it is, I had a blast watching this and getting all of the nostalgia. Soul. This is the first time I've seen this since its Oscar season, and unfortunately it wasn't as great as I remembered it being. The emotional story arc of the third act and Trent Reznor, Atticus Ross, and John Baptiste's score are the standouts of the film. It is nice to see that someone took over 22's job of messing with the Knicks, though. Puss in Boots: The Last Wish. This film immediately joins Shrek 1 and 2 as the best of the franchise. The animation style in this is beautiful and does a great job of separating it from the previous films. The story is equal parts hilarious and emotional, and is absolutely worthy of all the praise it received. Madagascar. I mentioned earlier that I love stories with misfit characters coming together. What works so well in Madagascar is that there are multiple different groups of misfit characters who are fun in their own groups, but also work really well with the entire ensemble. I watched this film so many times as a kid that I was convinced that I had seen the entire series. Madagascar: Escape to Africa. Like I just said, I thought I had seen the whole series, but clearly I hadn't because I had no memory of this. I could have done without the Melman and Gloria love storyline, but surprisingly that ended up having more heart than Alex reuniting with his parents, so I guess I was okay with it by the end. I'm sure someday I'll finish this series, but this one didn't make me super eager to keep going. The Lego Movie. As a kid, I was never really into Legos, so when this came out, I just assumed it was a kid's movie that I wouldn't be interested in. Over the years, I've heard nothing but amazing things about the film, and while it didn't completely win me over to the same degree, I can see why so many people love it. The cast are all great though, and Will Ferrell really stands out in the final scenes. Wolfwalkers. I was a really big fan of this the year it came out, to the point that I was rooting for it to win Best Animated Feature at the Oscars. I didn't love it as much watching it years later, but I was still blown away by how beautiful the animation is. I haven't started yet, but this film makes me want to get into the rest of Cartoon Saloon's filmography. The Iron Giant. This is one of those films where I could have sworn I saw it once when I was really young, but nothing seemed familiar when watching it this month. The ending wasn't as sad as I was expecting it to be based on how I've heard people talk about the film, but it was still a moving and beautiful ending. Between watching his animated films and Mission Impossible: Ghost Protocol this month, I really wish Brad Bird would direct more than he does. Tarzan. At work, I was listening to a Phil Collins compilation album when You'll Be in My Heart began to play. Tarzan never stood out to me as a favorite from the Disney animated collection, but that soundtrack is so amazing that I was in the mood for a rewatch. While nothing else in the film comes close to the soundtrack, it's still a fun viewing experience. Incredibles 2. When I saw this in theaters, it felt as fresh and new as the original since I hadn't seen that for years. Having rewatched the first and this one so closely after, it definitely isn't on the same level, but it is still a ton of fun. I didn't care for the villain in this as much as I did Syndrome, but the addition of Jack Jack is so much fun that it's easy to see how the franchise can continue to Incredibles 3 whenever that comes out. Monsters University. Despite my love for the original Monsters, Inc., I never saw this sequel until this month. It has a lot of the same beats as the original, but really missing the heart that Boo brought to the film. John Goodman and Billy Crystal's chemistry carries the film. The Rugrats Movie. Toy Story was the movie franchise of my childhood, but Rugrats was the cartoon of my childhood. This is the first time I've visited this since I was very young, with my orange VHS tapes. I will say this is a kids show that isn't as enjoyable to watch as an adult, but I still had fun taking this trip down nostalgia lane. Fantastic Mr. Fox. I like everything I've seen from Wes Anderson's filmography, but I haven't seen enough of his filmography to really fall in love with it. The film doesn't have Anderson's full cast of regulars, but the few that are here, in addition to the rest of the voice cast, really bring all the characters to life. Between this and the Phoenician Scheme being released this weekend, I'm itching to get to a full Wes Anderson deep dive. Princess Mononoke. I really wish I liked Studio Ghibli and Miyazaki's films as much as everyone else, because they're all so beautiful to look at. I admittedly have still only seen a couple of them, so I'm sure with time I will love them more and more as I see them. While they don't always work for me, I love the adventure in all of their stories, and Princess Mononoke is no different. Lost in Starlight. This is the only 2025 entry on the list. I knew nothing about the film going into it, besides Cinema Joe's glowing review on Letterboxd. It's not necessarily one of my favorite films of the year, but it has a lot of cute moments and is worth checking out on Netflix. Rugrats in Paris, the movie. Of all the Rugrats films and TV episodes I watched as a kid, this was my favorite, and was always heavy in the rotation. I remember this being really emotional, but I was surprised on this rewatch to see that emotion still held up. It's also fun seeing the references in these films that I finally get now, like the Godfather references. Rugrats Go Wild. I don't think I watched much Wild Thornberrys as a kid, and if I did, it was nowhere near as much as I watched the Rugrats. But I watched this so much as a kid that when I revisited it last week, you could drop me right in with these characters, and I knew everyone. Again, these aren't some cinematic masterpieces, but if I'm ever in a nostalgic mood, I'll throw on some Rugrats in the background again. Lilo and Stitch. I know this was one of my sister's favorites as a kid, but this never really stuck with me. I think I had a lot more fun with this on my rewatch now than I did as a kid. I haven't seen the live-action remake yet, but I'm always nervous to see if they ruin the charm. Spider-Man, Across the Spider-Verse. Upon its release, it felt like everyone immediately moved this ahead of Into the Spider-Verse for the best of the series. It didn't quite get to that level for me, but I absolutely love the animation style and the story that continues from the first. Now we really just need everyone involved to get into the studio and hammer out Beyond the Spider-Verse already. How to Train Your Dragon. I was extremely late to the How to Train Your Dragon party. I didn't see any of these films until the third was released, and this entered into the best trilogies of all time discussions. I really wish I liked these as much as everyone else, but I do appreciate how beautiful the animation is here, to the point that I'm not very optimistic about the live-action remake. Akira. Outside of seeing the poster and knowing that it is really well received, I didn't know anything about the story. Let me tell you, this completely caught me off guard. I know I liked it, but this is a film that I'll have to watch again to know how much it all worked for me. Aladdin. This is another one of the Disney classics that I think I'm a bigger fan of the soundtrack than I am of the movie. I never cared for many of the characters, and so the film never quite had the charm that other Disney classics did. It is still great to see Robin Williams on full display, though. Hercules. As a kid, there was always something about Hades as a villain that worked really well for me, and as far as Disney sidekick characters go, Danny DeVito's Phil is in the upper echelon. It wasn't as good as I remembered as a kid, but I still had a ton of fun. Up. The opening scene of this is so damn good that whatever happens next couldn't change my love for the film. There are some elements of the story that don't really captivate me, but the film's ability to tie it all back to the emotion with Ellie is beautiful. This is a film that I definitely don't watch enough, based on the love that I have for it. The Emperor's New Groove. I never considered this a favorite of my childhood, but after this rewatch it definitely belongs in the favorites tier. A quick-paced comedy with so many quotable lines. The film also has one of the best voice casts out of all the films I watched this month. Ratatouille. I know this is widely considered as a favorite by many, but it never was one that I loved. I will give the film credit for being from a studio full of far-out story ideas. This is one of the most unique. Patton Oswalt is great as always, but it's Peter O'Toole who elevates the film. Now, I will say that from my original Letterboxd 4 in the preview video to now, there is one change, so let's talk about the film that dropped out. The Incredibles. Taking the best parts of the superhero genre, while also adding in the heart that many superhero films lack, The Incredibles is a masterpiece. As a kid, the villain reveal completely blew my mind. This was tough to leave out of the Letterboxd 4, but don't worry, I have a good feeling it'll be back in a couple months. Now let's jump straight into the Letterboxd 4, Monsters, Inc. Lovable Sully and his wisecracking sidekick Mike Wazowski are the top scare team at Monsters Incorporated, the scream processing factory in Monstropolis. When a little girl named Boo wanders into their world, it's the monsters who are scared silly, and it's up to Sully and Mike to keep her out of sight and get her back home. Randy Newman won for Best Original Song at the Oscars in 2002 for If I Didn't Have You. The film was also nominated for Best Animated Feature, Best Sound Editing, and Best Original Score. Monsters, Inc. was released in 2001 and was directed by Pete Docter. The film stars John Goodman, Billy Crystal, and Steve Buscemi. Now, I talked about Toy Story kind of being like that film franchise from when I was a kid, but Monsters, Inc. is kind of right behind it. Like, that is kind of, if I disregarded like the Toy Story franchise, like Monsters, Inc. was the other film that when I was a little kid, I just absolutely loved. This is a film that, again, I have a very memorable, like, I remember seeing this in the theater. I remember watching it at home when, when we had the this is probably, yeah, still a little too early for DVD, so we probably had like the VHS that we would watch. I remember just watching this so much as a kid, and it's interesting to me. I don't know necessarily as a kid why this is one that I think stood out. I wonder if it really was just the character design. I really think it was just the concept of the characters all being monsters. And I think I was a really big fan of the concept of like why, it's not just, some, obviously, some horror movie. I feel like a lot of character or a lot of movies that have monsters as your main characters probably is more likely than not just like some kind of horror movie. So I think I really kind of like this idea of taking these monsters and putting like a spin on why they're doing what they're doing. Like, yeah, they're going in and they're under your bed and they're in your closet and they're here to scare you, but then all of a sudden, like, taking it like a step back and viewing this from the monster's perspective of like, well, why are they doing that? I think it was just like a really fun concept that I had a blast with. And again, that is just I guess the story, like the concept of the story. But I think I really also was just a massive fan of, like I just said, like the character design, getting, big Sully, kind of maybe more so like what you would think of like a traditional, just kind of almost a little bit more of like an animal design to him, obviously, other than walking around on all fours. If he was an animal at his size, probably would be on all fours. But it's kind of like more of this typical, more familiar type of monster design. And then you get Mike Wazowski, who's just kind of this big green ball with one eyeball, but like everything else feels right. He's got two hands, two legs, two arms. Like everything else seems normal besides just this one eyeball on this, and I guess no body, just kind of like legs and then instantly a face. So I just remember that being a really cool character design. Randall is just such a unique, again, kind of a little bit more back into like the animal type world. Like he's a little bit more animalistic, but just a real fun, different character design. I'm drawing a blank on her name, but the I'm always watching you, Mike Wazowski. All of a sudden she's this Mike's girlfriend. With her seems a little bit more normal, but then she's got the hair that has all of the different heads on each of the braids. So many different things that it's a very upbeat, fun, vibrant kind of movie, and I think the character design, everything all just kind of comes together really well for me with Monsters Inc. But really, the biggest reason why I think I loved it is the emotion. I used to say this as a kid. I remember there was one day that my parents were watching The Notebook, and I was, how old would I have been at this time? Maybe like 10. I don't think I was quite like a teenager, but I remember kind of coming in. It was just like at the end of the movie because I didn't, at this age, I'm not watching The Notebook, but I remember kind of coming in late, and as my parents were watching, it's kind of the final scene, and I remember they were crying, and there was something about that, like seeing them cry watching this movie, made me start crying at the end of The Notebook when I hadn't seen anything, like I didn't know what was going on, but it was just like seeing my parents cry made me cry. And I used to say that The Notebook was like the second movie that ever made me cry because Monsters Inc. definitely made me cry as a kid, and it was one of those things where, and I guess other movies made me cry in terms of like I was scared and I was crying as a little kid, but Monsters Inc. was like, it was a good cry, and I remember even as a kid seeing Monsters Inc. and like crying at the end of the movie, but still being like happy, and like it's a feel good cry. And so I think that this film, I think, maybe had that kind of special place in my heart because of that, because of it kind of introducing that idea to me of like being in touch with your emotions, and like a story that can invoke these emotions from you. Any sort of story that is that powerful is a great story. And so again, there's so many reasons, and rewatching it now, it's the first time I've seen Monsters Inc. in a long time, but it's just jumping straight into it immediately. From the first scene to the last scene, I was completely in love with it all over again, just watching this. It really is just, again, not only just a childhood favorite of mine, but really just an all-time favorite in this animation genre. Perfect Blue. Encouraged by her managers, rising pop star Mima takes on a recurring role on a popular TV show when suddenly her handlers and collaborators begin turning up murdered. Perfect Blue was released in 1997 and was directed by Satoshi Kon. The film stars Junko Iwao, Rika Matsumoto, and Shaiho Niyama. Now, first off, I would like to again apologize for probably butchering the pronunciation on those names. Obviously, not super familiar with everyone here. But the second thing that I want to say with putting Perfect Blue in this is, like I said earlier, with Shrek 2 was the film that I originally had in. I originally, on my doc, my when I get this all kind of organized, I had typed up and put everything in there for Shrek 2 to be the fourth film in the Letterboxd 4. And that was like I kind of had it all ready, and maybe it's kind of jumping the gun a little bit before I had, I was watching Perfect Blue yesterday as I was doing that. And so I was watching Perfect Blue, and it was one of those that as I was watching it I was so confused, and I know that there was things that I liked, but I was like, oh, maybe this didn't all kind of work together for me. But I was like, and certain scenes where I'm like, okay, that it didn't quite work for me because I wasn't sure what they were saying, or I wasn't sure what the message or what was actually happening in the scene. And so it was one of those things that when it came to the end I was like, I know I liked it, but it just, I'm like, I'll need another rewatch. Kind of the same thing with Akira. I was like, I think I'm going to need another rewatch to really understand what was going on and to understand to what degree I love this film. And then this weird thing happened that after watching it and kind of, making my doc, putting Shrek 2 in there, I kept thinking about Perfect Blue. It kept sticking with me, and there would be things, it would be like an hour or two later after I'd seen it, and all of a sudden something would kind of pop up, and I'm like, oh yeah, what did that mean? And so then I like would look up something, or I looked up on YouTube just kind of like for people their kind of their breakdowns, kind of watching those videos, and then I saw that there's a channel I follow here, Blind Wave. They do great reactions to movies and TV and stuff, and I saw that they had done a reaction to Perfect Blue, so I watched their reaction to it, and I saw that they were kind of hitting a lot of the same things that I was hitting, where it's like some of the things aren't making sense, and you're kind of questioning. At least for me, I was questioning a little bit more if I was just kind of just dumb and not getting it. But then when I was watching it again, I guess watching their reaction, it fully like clicked for me, and it made way more sense of things aren't supposed, like everything's not supposed to, this film isn't trying to like lay everything out in this nice, neat, organized way. It's a film about our main character who kind of the unreliable narrator, where she's kind of struggling mentally. There's some other characters that they're kind of going through some things mentally, and so it's kind of this thing of you don't know what you can trust. And this film does an amazing job of, like I said, not like putting you in the characters, like the space with them, where they don't really know what they can trust, and so you as the audience, you don't really know what you can trust. There'll be these scenes that look like they're playing out like a normal scene, and then all of a sudden you'll realize, oh, it was a dream sequence. And then from the end of that dream sequence, it'll kind of go on, and it'll go on for who knows how long, 10, 15 minutes, and all of a sudden that will end, and then you realize you were back in another dream sequence. And so it's this thing of like you don't know exactly, or kind of the idea again of the dream sequence elements, the elements of there being seemingly two versions of our main character, and then the elements of her being an actor. And so there will be so many scenes that are kind of like, it looks like we're watching the movie, but you realize that that's actually just her performing in the television show that she's performing in. So there's so many different things in this that like it's not all making sense because it's not supposed to. Like, it's supposed to be a thing where you're supposed to just kind of take what you take from it, and that is the story. That is the story that you were meant to get from it. And it just became this thing that the more and more time kind of went on after seeing this, initially I thought, I was pretty comfortable with, Shrek 2 being in this list, and then I just kept. I've thought about this film more than like almost any other film that I like. After I see a film, I can kind of just not necessarily forget it, but I can kind of be like, oh, that was done, and I kind of move past it, and weeks will go by before I think about it again. I haven't stopped thinking about Perfect Blue, and so it just is one that I felt like it had to get a spot in here because of any film that can kind of evoke that from you and can put you in that headspace is just beautiful. And it's like that's the type of film that I want to be watching. I want to be watching these films that again kind of challenge you, but also just challenge the way that you are understanding this media and understanding the art that you're watching, because this is a nice experiment to kind of just like again challenge the like what you're comfortable with and really kind of pull you in a lot of different directions. I don't want to say a whole ton necessarily, maybe kind of about the the script, because I'm assuming this is out of the four here. This is, I guess, I don't know. I mean, at least maybe here in America, maybe it's the least seen out of these four. So I really encourage you go watch it if you haven't seen it. I will just say that this was also a nice kind of change of pace, because I did say that this is it's just animation was really kind of the only requirement for this month. I did lean very heavily towards children and like kids movies. As you saw, a lot of it was me just kind of having fun going down nostalgia lane and watching all of these old Disney films that I haven't seen in 20 years. And so this was really kind of a nice kind of little change of pace, because between like this and Akira, and I guess kind of Fantastic Mr. Fox, even though I felt like that was a little more kid friendly than I was expecting it to be. But essentially, it's just kind of like this and Akira were kind of the two only like adult films that I watched, and this one being way more like suspenseful and this thriller mystery with some scenes really well shot and crafted like a horror film. There was so much that was just coming together in perfect blue, to where combining all of that with the fact that I haven't been able to stop thinking about this film, it just made me realize that even without completely understanding it, I love it, and it really deserved a spot here in the Letterboxd 4. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. Struggling to find his place in the world while juggling school and family, Brooklyn teenager Miles Morales is unexpectedly bitten by a radioactive spider and develops unfathomable powers, just like the one and only Spider-Man. While wrestling with the implications of his new abilities, Miles discovers a super collider created by the madman Wilson Kingpin Fisk, causing others from across the Spider-Verse to be inadvertently transported to his dimension. The film won for Best Animated Feature at the Oscars in 2019. Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse was released in 2018 and was directed by Bob Persichetti, Peter Ramsey, and Rodney Rothman. The film stars Shameik Moore, Jake Johnson, and Haley Steinfeld. Now, as a kid, Spider-Man was like my superhero as a kid. That was the only superhero franchise that I think really intrigued me, and I think probably part of the reason why it's the only franchise that intrigued me as a kid, was it was the only films that like I think at least superhero films that my parents let us watch and like took us to the theater to see. At least like Spider-Man 2 I know we saw in theaters, and maybe Spider-Man 1. I didn't watch a whole lot of superhero movies as a kid, but Spider-Man always had that spot in my heart. I always loved Spider-Man. Now, with the I mean, I didn't see any of the Andrew Garfield in theaters, because those would have been coming out when I wasn't when my family just didn't go to the movie theater. And then the Tom Holland ones I just wasn't really watching, for part of it being that I wasn't like fully back into going to the movie, or wasn't, at that point in my life going to the movies as much as I do now. But also part of it being that I knew that it was in the MCU, and I hadn't seen really anything in the MCU prior to that, and so I kind of was even just kind of skipping. I guess to that point I had only skipped uh, Homecoming, so I just missed the one Tom Holland Spider-Man before getting caught up with Endgame, and then really going into seeing everything Marvel and MCU like in the theaters. But I had kind of just was skipping those, and so the same thing kind of happened when this came out. This came out 2018, so the year before I really got back into going to the movies, and so I kind of had just skipped this because I just didn't care to go to the movies, didn't care to actually see this, and at this point I really wasn't going to the movies to see an animated film, which is dumb. Like, animation is some of the best movies are animated, and it really lends itself. And one thing that I eventually learned from this film is that animation could lend itself into these areas where you can't tell some of these stories, you can't tell live action. I mean, you can, but it's going to be a definite like step down and lesser version of what you can tell through the animation style. And so I remember when I finally rented this on Redbox, because I had heard nothing but amazing things about it, and I remember watching it, the Redbox, and instantly just being blown away, and then being really mad at myself for not going and seeing this in the theaters, because I loved it at home, but I love everything I think more in the theater on a first watch, just being able to see it in the intended format. But I still absolutely was just blown away by this, was so in love with this one specifically. I mean, between both this and Across the Spider Verse, the animation style is similar, but there's definitely kind of some new things that they kind of experiment a little bit with in Across the Spider Verse. Into the Spider Verse, if I mean, to be fair, they were experimenting with a lot of the stuff they were doing in this one too, because it was just different enough than from what you were seeing in typical animated films. And there's just so many sequences. The "What's Up Danger" sequence, that's another that I just, it's one thing to sit, talk about Monsters Inc. and talk about that ending making me cry because of how emotional and it's the cap of this story. That "What's Up Danger" scene made me cry, I think, the first time watching it, because it's just such a beautifully isolated moment in the film of, it's not capping, recapping necessarily the story, but it's kind of like the cap on his growth and his, kind of becoming and stepping into the role of Spider-Man. And he's kind of struggling to this point in the, early in the film. Once he kind of get to this point where he's now, needing to really kind of step up and be there for this group of friends that he's made of spider people, that "What's Up Danger" scene is just so beautiful in the way that it is animated, the way that it all comes together, the song kind of kicking in right there. It just makes me emotional just seeing that. And so again, this is a film that I did not expect to really get emotional about, but it absolutely brought that to me. And this is just one of those that I'm just so desperate for Beyond the Spider-Verse to get here already, because this is one that I think as soon as that film comes out, this is another one of those franchises that we can immediately just put in those discussions of the best trilogies of all time. And I would say as long as three kind of nails the landing, but even then, even if it's kind of a little bit clunky or maybe isn't as good as the first two, these first two in this franchise are just so strong and they're so amazing that I don't think you're going to find a lot of people that would really argue with you on that, on that this wouldn't be immediately one of the best trilogies ever, at least in the discussion. There's so many great trilogies, but this would be right there. This film, the way that the action, and again the way that they use the animation style to tell the story and to put all that action together. There's so many different scenes. The whole kind of the kind of the final battle or whatever is they're fighting with Doc Ock and Kingpin, and they're in the collider. The way that is set up through the animation is something that, like, I don't even want to imagine what that would have looked like in live action, because you just wouldn't have been able to make it work and look as good. And so this is one that, Sony, for there were some parts of the Andrew Garfield Spider-Mans that were good, but it just kind of feels like in between that and then between what Sony's been doing with all of their Sinister Six attempts, it feels like they just don't quite have it figured out on what they're doing live action wise with Spider-Man, but they absolutely know what they're doing here with the Spider-Verse trilogy. This film is beautiful. I love it. I think this isn't a hot take. A lot of people really love this film, but it really deserves a spot in the final four. Toy Story 2. Andy heads off to cowboy camp, leaving his toys to their own devices. Things shift into high gear when an obsessive toy collector named Al McWiggin, owner of Al's Toy Barn, kidnaps Woody. Andy's toys mount a daring rescue mission. Buzz Lightyear meets his match, and Woody has to decide where he and his heart truly belong. Randy Newman was nominated for Best Original Song at the Oscars in 2000 for When She Loved Me. Toy Story 2 was released in 1999 and was directed by John Lasseter. The film stars Tom Hanks, Tim Allen, and Joan Cusack. Now, this was no surprise. The entire video, you knew a Toy Story film was going to make it here. And I think maybe the only real surprise, if you didn't see my preview video, the surprise is that I picked Toy Story 2. I think that in terms of the Letterboxd ratings, it's the lowest of the original three. I think Toy Story 3 is number one, and then Toy Story 1, and then Toy Story 2 behind it. But this is one of those where it's kind of like I said when I was talking about Toy Story 3, as much as I love that film, it is probably one of my top 10 favorite movies of all time. But so are 1 and 2. The entire trilogy is all up there in terms of favorite films of all time. And as much as I love 3, it does unfortunately, and honestly, now that more time has gone by since that came out in theaters, maybe eventually it's going to kind of gain the nostalgia factor with it, but as of right now, it just doesn't have the same nostalgia factor that 1 and 2 do, because, again, those were my movies, like, as a kid. I absolutely loved the films. I loved Buzz Lightyear. Like, this was. I'm sure, I don't know how many times I watched the Toy Story films as a kid, but just a million times probably. Like, I just absolutely loved these films. And so 1 and 2 kind of had that extra benefit that 3 just doesn't have. So I knew I was going to pick either 1 or 2 for this Letterboxd 4, and I think ultimately I end up picking 2, and it's kind of the exact same thing as like the Shrek films, where Toy Story 1 and Shrek 1, they're both great, they're both amazing, introduce you to all your characters, but then the sequel comes around, and it does this real fun thing where it just kind of carries on. You retain a lot of the same cast of characters, but then they start introducing new characters, and some of them just like work so well. In Shrek 2, you get Puss in Boots. In Toy Story 2, you get Jessie, you get Bullseye. Those are, I mean, the real main two. But then, I mean, you get this. That's when you first get Mrs. Potato Head. The Prospector obviously doesn't stick around, but for just that film alone, he's such a memorable character. And so it's one of those things of when I look back and I think of those two franchises, when I think of the original two Shreks, when I think about what makes those films great and what I really love about those films, sure, obviously I'm thinking of Shrek, I'm thinking of Donkey, but I'm thinking of Puss in Boots. Like, that's such an important part of that, the early films. And the same thing with Toy Story. It's so important to me that when I think of these characters, that I think of Jessie and I think of Bullseye and I think of their inclusion in the group. And so it's just one of those things that I think that ultimately is kind of the tiebreaker for me. As much as I love the first Toy Story, as much as I love Toy Story 3, Toy Story 2 being the introduction to Jessie, bringing her into the group, bringing in, Bullseye and kind of I mean, obviously both Jessie and Bullseye are supposed to be like adjacent to Woody, but obviously Buzz and Jessie kind of have a little bit more of that chemistry, but then Bullseye is very much just kind of loyal to Woody and kind of brings that chemistry to it. It's just one that I absolutely just love Toy Story 2, and it's also really fun for me because I talked about this in the setup video. I'll talk about it again now because it's just really fun to think about that. Part of my love for this film is it's just I loved the film so much, but it's like I loved everything Toy Story. Like, I had a Buzz Lightyear toy, I had Woody toys, I think I had a Jessie and a Bullseye toy. Like, I had a lot of the toys from the film, and but in addition to that, I also, as I was getting older and kind of graduating from toys, and a lot of boys do when you kind of graduate from toys into video games, I had a Toy Story video game. I remember playing. I think there was a couple different ones I had, but there's one in particular that I remember playing a ton, just on the original PlayStation. And there were a couple levels. I remember you're playing as Buzz, I think, for a lot of the levels, and there's one where you're kind of in the kitchen and you're escaping the house, and then I think it's you escape, and then I think it had, if I remember right, it's been, obviously this has been 2 decades since I've played this game or even like looked it up, but I think you get in like the cones and stuff and you cross the street and you get to Al's Toy Barn, but then there's like multiple levels. Like, almost half the game I feel like you're playing as Buzz Lightyear in Al's Toy Barn, and so there's so much about that specific setting for the film that just I'm so nostalgic for that, the entire Al's Toy Barn, because again, just introducing Al as a character, introducing Barbie as a character at Al's Toy Barn, that's just, it's so nostalgic for me, being in that element, being in that location. Again, in the film, the Rock'em Sock'em robots, introduced in that part. There's just so much about that I just love. And then I remember. Actually, I don't really remember. I don't know if I ever beat the game. I don't know if there's ever anything like at the airport. Like, I don't remember if that is like an important part of the game, but obviously such an important part of the movie, such an amazing action set piece that is put together there at the airport. There's so much about this that just, when I think, again, like I said, because I've already kind of narrowed it down to 1 and 2 being my favorites of the franchise, there's so much about when I think about the original films the highlights and what I love the most, a lot of it is in 2, and so it just kind of ultimately made the decision itself for me that again, I would have Toy Story 1, Toy Story 2, Toy Story 3. Those would all be in my Letterboxd 4 if I didn't limit this to just one entry per franchise. But because I put that limitation on there, it just kind of worked itself out where Toy Story 2 was the obvious choice for me to put in that Letterboxd 4. Thank you so much for watching this video. Let me know down below in the comments what some of your favorite animated movies of all time are. Also, just let me know, what you thought of any of these films. Are there some? Are you kind of mad that I didn't have Shrek in there? I feel like Shrek's probably a pretty obvious one for a lot of people. I feel like Lion King is a pretty obvious thing in there. Studio Ghibli is probably going to be in there for a lot of people. But yeah, just let me know what your Letterboxd 4 would be for animated films. And also, just to give you a heads up, the preview video for the month of June is going to come out in the next couple days later this week. I've already started watching a couple of the films in preparation for that, so we'll do that preview video in the next couple days, so expect that on the channel. And if you would like to like this video and then subscribe to the channel so you don't miss that video and any other videos in the different series that I have on this channel, I would greatly appreciate it, and have a great day.